Two siblings age out of the foster system to inherit their missing uncle's dilapidated farm, only to discover a recently rebuilt cellar wall that holds the key to his disappearance and a choice that will define their future. If this story sounds like something you can connect with, a story about finding your way back to a truth you thought was lost, I hope you'll stick around, maybe even hit that subscribe button. We're building a community here for people who know what it's like to start over from nothing. The day I turned 18 was the day I legally ceased to exist as a problem for the state of New York. I became, in the eyes of the law, a man. In the eyes of Mrs. Gable, the house manager at Northwood Group Home for Boys, I was just one more empty bed she could finally fill. She handed me a thin, worn cardboard box containing the sum total of my worldly possessions. 3 changes of clothes, a dog-eared copy of a book on constellations my uncle had given me, a faded photograph of my parents, and 2 years of carefully saved allowance money, totaling $112. Her handshake was dry and brief, the rustle of paper skin. "Good luck, Leo," she'd said, her voice holding the same flat, practiced neutrality she used when announcing dinner was ready, or that someone's weekend visit had been canceled. It was a voice designed to prevent emotion, either hers or yours. After 2 years under her roof, it had mostly worked. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel particularly free. I just felt quiet. The quiet of a room after the television has been shut off, the air still humming with a phantom noise. Outside, the November air was sharp and smelled of impending snow. It bit at the exposed skin on my wrists where my jacket sleeves were too short. My sister Mia was waiting for me on the curb, perched on her own cardboard box like a small, defiant gargoyle guarding a crumbling cathedral. She was 16, and my emancipation meant she was now my responsibility, a fact that sat in my stomach like a cold stone. The court had approved my petition for guardianship, a minor miracle pushed through by a tired but decent social worker who believed siblings should stick together. So now I was it. Parent, brother, provider, a man. I had $112 and a sister whose fierce, dark eyes dared the world to hurt her one more time. "You ready?" she asked, her breath a small white cloud in the air. I nodded, because it was the only answer possible. "Where are we going?" The question hung there, simple and impossible. I had a vague plan, the kind a boy makes when he's trying to convince himself he's a man. A bus ticket to the city, a youth shelter for a few nights, a job washing dishes, an apartment eventually. It was a flimsy blueprint held together with hope and sheer terror. Before I could answer, a final figure emerged from the heavy doors of the group home. It was Mr. Evans, my social worker. He was a good man, perpetually overworked, with deep lines of empathy etched around his eyes. He wasn't smiling. "Leo, a moment," he said, holding up a large, stiff manila envelope. It looked important. It looked heavy. "This came for you, to the county office. It was addressed to you, to be delivered on your 18th birthday. I took it from him. My name was typed on the front, Leo Blackwood. Below it, Mia's. Mia Blackwood. It was from a law firm, Albright and Finch. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It's about your uncle," he said, his expression softening with something that looked like pity. "His estate. He's been declared legally deceased. 7 years is the standard wait time." 7 years. The words echoed in the quiet space inside me. 7 years since we'd woken up to a cold house and an empty driveway. 7 years since the police had come, then the social workers. 7 years of being told he'd just left, abandoned us. A simple, cruel story that had become the foundation of our lives. "There's not much," Mr. Evans added, as if to soften a blow I didn't even know was coming. "Some property, I think, but there are complications, debts. The lawyer's letter explains it. I'm sorry, Leo. I wish it was better news." He gave my shoulder a brief, firm squeeze. "You're a good kid. You'll figure it out. You both will." And then he was gone, leaving me and Mia on the sidewalk with our cardboard boxes, $100, and a ghost in a manila envelope. We didn't speak as we walked to the bus station. The envelope felt radioactive in my hands. Mia kept glancing at it, her usual sharp edges softened by a raw, naked curiosity. We bought 2 one-way tickets to a town I hadn't seen since I was 10 years old. Oakhaven. Not the city, not the plan. The bus groaned and hissed, pulling away from the curb and leaving the sterile brick facade of the group home behind. We found 2 seats in the back, the worn vinyl cold against my legs. For a long time, we just watched the gray uniform suburbs slide past the window. Then Mia nudged my arm. "Well," she said, "are you going to open it or just stare at it until it catches fire?" I took a breath and tore the seal. Inside were several thick, formal-looking documents stapled together. On top was a letter addressed to us. I read it aloud, my voice low and unsteady. It was from a Miss Evelyn Albright. She was the executor of the estate of Silas Blackwood. It confirmed what Mr. Evans had said. Our uncle was legally dead. We, as his next of kin, were his sole heirs. We inherited everything. And everything, it turned out, was Blackwood Farm. 40 acres of land, a house, a barn, and several outbuildings. I felt a strange, hollow feeling in my chest. A memory, thin as smoke, of running through tall grass, the smell of hay and summer dirt. Mia's reaction was more practical. "A farm? What are we supposed to do with a farm?" The next paragraph answered her question. The property, Ms. Albright wrote in cool, legal prose, carried a substantial lien against it for unpaid property taxes, accrued over the 7 years of Silas's absence. The debt was in the tens of thousands of dollars. The county would seize the property in 30 days if it wasn't paid. A beat of silence. Then Mia swore, a short, sharp word. It wasn't a farm, it was a debt. It was another one of his messes. But there was one more section. Ms. Albright went on to state that there was a standing offer on the property from a corporation called Pioneer Valley Estates. They were willing to purchase the entire 40 acres as is. Their offer was just enough to cover the back taxes and all associated legal fees, and would leave a remainder of approximately $20,000. $20,000. The number landed in the space between us, shimmering and impossibly large. To 2 kids with $100 to their name, it might as well have been $1 million. "Leo," Mia breathed, her eyes wide. 20,000. We could get an apartment, a real one. I could finish high school without all this. She gestured vaguely at our boxes, at the grimy bus window, at our entire lives up to that point. The offer, the letter concluded, was set to expire in 7 days. 1 week. We had 1 week to decide. Sell the last physical piece of our childhood for a clean break, a fresh start, or let it all be swallowed by the government, leaving us with nothing but the same story of being left behind. We sell, Mia said, her voice firm, decided. We take the money and we never look back. Right, Leo? I should have said yes. Every rational part of my brain was screaming it. It was the smart move, the only move. It was freedom, gift-wrapped and offered to us on a silver platter. But I couldn't form the word. All I could think about was a hand-carved bird, a booming laugh that smelled of sawdust, and the feeling of being safe. I remembered my uncle, not the phantom who abandoned us, but the man who taught me the names of the stars. Before we decide, I said slowly, the words tasting strange in my mouth, I want to see it, one last time. Mia stared at me, her brief hope curdling into familiar frustration. Why? It's just a broken-down house, Leo. It's a bad memory. Maybe, I said, looking out the window as the landscape began to shift, the tight clusters of houses giving way to wider, emptier spaces. But it's ours. For now, anyway. The rest of the bus ride was a blur of muted colors and the low drone of the engine. Mia put in her headphones, a clear sign she was done talking, and stared out the window, her reflection a pale, unhappy mask. I leaned my head against the cool glass and let the rhythmic jostling of the bus pull me down into a half-sleep filled with fragmented images. The splintery texture of the barn door, the specific green of the woods behind the house in summer, the sour, sweet smell of apples rotting on the ground in the fall. These weren't solid memories, just faint sensory ghosts. When Silas took us in after our parents' car crash, I was 8 and Mia was 6. He was our mother's older brother, a man we'd only seen a handful of times at holidays, a quiet, looming figure who always seemed more comfortable outdoors than in. Suddenly, he was all we had, and for 2 years he was a surprisingly good parent. He wasn't warm in a conventional way. He wasn't a man for hugs or easy reassurances, but he was present. He cooked us dense, heavy meals. He checked our homework. He taught me how to identify oak trees and maples, how to find the North Star. He fixed things, the leaky faucet, the rattling screen door, my broken toy truck. He had a workshop in the barn filled with tools that he handled with a quiet, confident reverence. To an 8-year-old boy who had just lost everything, a man who could fix what was broken felt like a superhero. Then, one Tuesday morning, he was gone. His truck, his wallet, his work boots, all gone. We waited. The days stretched on, silent and strange. By nightfall, a deep, primal fear had set in. A neighbor found us the next day, huddled together on the porch. The story the adults pieced together was simple. He'd packed a bag and left. People in small towns did that sometimes, they said. Got overwhelmed, needed to escape. He'd left 2 kids behind, but maybe he just couldn't handle it. The narrative was cemented. Silas Blackwood was a coward. He had abandoned us. And for the next 8 years, in 3 different foster homes and 1 group home, that was the story we carried. It was heavy, and it was sharp, and it had shaped the people we were becoming. Mia's anger was a shield. My quietness was a foxhole. The bus finally wheezed into the small depot in Oakhaven. It hadn't changed. The same peeling paint on the station house, the same faded mural of a covered bridge on the wall of the adjacent hardware store. A single taxi was idling by the curb, the driver a stooped man with a face like a wrinkled apple. He looked us and our boxes up and down. "Where to?" he grunted. I gave him the address, the name of the road sounding foreign on my tongue. His eyes flickered with something. Recognition, maybe? He grunted again and popped the trunk. The drive was about 10 minutes, moving from the tiny cluster of shops and houses that made up the town center to a landscape of rolling hills and bare, skeletal trees. The farther we went, the more the silence pressed in. "You kids are Blackwoods, then?" the driver asked, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. I nodded. "Thought so. You've got his look," he said, gesturing with his chin at me. "Silas, haven't seen anyone up at that place in years. Heard he just took off." "That's what they say," I said, my voice tight. "Huh. Never pegged him for the type," the driver mused, more to himself than to us. "He was a stubborn man, quiet, but he wasn't a runner. Seemed to me like he'd finally found a place to put down roots, especially after you two came along." He fell silent after that, and I was grateful. His words, meant to be casual, were like fingers probing a bruise. We turned onto a dirt road nearly swallowed by overgrown weeds. The taxi bounced and rattled, branches scraping against the sides of the car like fingernails. And then the trees cleared, and we saw it. The house stood on a low rise, stark against the gray sky. It was smaller than I remembered, and infinitely sadder. The paint was almost entirely gone, the wood underneath weathered to a silver gray. The porch roof sagged dangerously in the middle. One of the windows on the second floor was boarded up. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a shipwreck. Mia made a small, choked sound beside me. It was a sound of pure disappointment. This was the place I'd dragged her to, this ruin. The driver pulled to a stop where the driveway dissolved into a muddy patch of grass. "This is as far as I can go," he said. I paid him from my precious cash reserve, my hands fumbling with the bills. He took the money, but then paused, his hand on the gear shift. "Listen, kid," he said, his voice lower now. "There's a motel back in town, the Sleepy Hollow. It's cheap. And the diner next door, they might be hiring for a busboy. Just don't stay out here. There's nothing left for you here." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to me all day. I thanked him. He nodded once and reversed slowly back down the lane, leaving us standing in the profound, heavy silence of the countryside. For a full minute, we just stood there, two small figures dwarfed by the skeletal trees and the collapsing house. The wind cut across the open field, cold and sharp. "Well," Mia said, her voice brittle, "this is great. Just great, Leo. I can see why you wanted to come back." She kicked at a clump of frozen mud. "Let's just agree to sell it and get out of here. Please." "First, we go inside," I said, my own resolve feeling thin. "The keys." The social worker had given me a small ring of them, tarnished with age. I found the one that looked like a house key and walked up the 3 sagging steps of the porch. They groaned under my weight. The lock was stiff with rust, but after a moment of wrestling with it, the bolt scraped back with a sound like a scream. I pushed the door open. The air that rolled out was thick and musty, the smell of trapped time. It smelled of dust, of mouse droppings, of decay. But underneath it all, there was something else. A faint, lingering scent of wood smoke and old paper. It was the smell of my uncle's house. It was the smell of a home I thought I'd forgotten. I stepped across the threshold, and Mia, after a moment's hesitation, followed me in. The inside was a landscape of ghosts. Every piece of furniture, the sofa, the armchairs, the big dining table, was draped in a white sheet, making the room look like it was populated by strange, lumpy phantoms. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, sparkling in the thin shafts of gray light filtering through the grimy windows. It was a perfect time capsule of the day he left. A coffee mug sat on the mantelpiece, a dark ring of residue at the bottom. A newspaper from 7 years ago was folded on a side table. I picked it up. The paper was yellowed and brittle. The headline was about something local, a zoning dispute. It was so mundane, so normal. It felt impossible that a life could just stop in the middle of such an ordinary day. Mia walked around the room, her footsteps silent on the dusty floorboards. She didn't touch anything. She looked like a visitor in a museum, detached and wary. "So, what are we looking for?" she asked, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. "Anything valuable?" I shook my head, though I wasn't sure. "I don't know. Memories, maybe." "Memories don't pay for a security deposit, Leo." She was right, of course. Her pragmatism was an anchor, while I was drifting out on a sea of sentimentality. We needed to be practical. We needed to think about the money. We started in the living room, lifting the corners of the sheets. The furniture underneath was old but solid. Heavy wood, worn upholstery. Nothing of any real monetary value. We moved to the kitchen. The shelves were empty, the pantry cleared out. He'd taken the food. That had always been one of the strangest details for the police. Who packs up the canned goods when they're abandoning their life? It suggested planning, a deliberate, methodical departure, not a panicked flight. Upstairs, we found the bedrooms. His was the sparest. A bed neatly made under its sheet, a dresser, a closet with a few flannel shirts and a pair of worn jeans still hanging inside. My old room and the one Mia and I had shared were even emptier. He'd packed up our things for us. They were in boxes stacked in a corner, labeled with his neat, blocky handwriting. Leo's stuff, Mia's toys. He had packed up our childhoods before he left them behind. It was both kind and incredibly cruel. Back downstairs, there was only one place left to look. A narrow door off the kitchen led to the cellar. It was colder here, the air heavy and damp. I pulled a string, and a single bare bulb flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows. Stone steps led down into the darkness. "I'm not going down there," Mia said immediately. "It smells like spiders." "Stay here then," I said, and started down. The steps were uneven, cut from the same gray stone as the walls. The cellar was larger than I expected, stretching out under the whole house. The floor was packed earth. Empty shelves lined one wall, probably once for canned goods and preserves. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil and something else, something sharp and mineral-like. Cement. I walked the perimeter, my sneakers crunching softly on the dirt. The walls were rough-hewn fieldstone, fitted together a century ago. The mortar was dark and crumbling in most places. But then I saw it. On the far wall, the one deepest under the house, there was a section that was different. It was a rectangle of stone about 6 feet wide and 4 feet high. The stones themselves were the same as the rest of the wall, gray and speckled with mica. But the mortar was new. It was a pale, bright gray, stark against the dark, crumbling mortar around it. The joints were clean, the work precise. It looked like it had been done yesterday. I ran my hand over it. The surface was gritty but solid. It was professional work. It was also completely out of place. Why would someone repair a single patch of a cellar wall in a house that was otherwise falling apart? And more importantly, Who did it? If my uncle had been gone for 7 years, this wall had been rebuilt by someone else. Or the story was wrong. "Mia," I called up the stairs. My voice sounded small in the big, empty space. "You need to see this." I heard her sigh, a theatrical sound of long suffering. Then her footsteps on the stairs. She stopped on the bottom step, hugging herself against the chill. "What?" I pointed. She followed my finger, her eyes narrowing. She saw it instantly. "Whoa," she whispered. "That's new." "Yeah," I said. "It is." We stood there for a long time, just staring at it. The neatly mortared stones seemed to hum with a silent question. The house was no longer just a sad, derelict building. The farm was no longer just a piece of land attached to a debt. This wall was a secret, and I had a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty that whatever was behind it was the real reason we were here. It was the inheritance our uncle had actually left us. I felt a prickle of fear, but underneath it, something else was stirring. A hot, fierce curiosity. The quiet in my soul was finally being replaced by a noise I recognized, the hunt for an answer. Mia, for all her talk of selling and leaving, was captivated too. The pragmatist in her was at war with the part of her that had also spent 8 years wondering why. "What do you think is back there?" she asked, her voice hushed. "I have no idea," I said, "but I think we're about to find out." The decision to open the wall wasn't really a decision at all. It was an inevitability, the only possible next step in a story that had been paused for 7 years. Finding the tools was the first challenge. The workshop in the barn was our best bet. The barn was even more dilapidated than the house, its huge doors hanging crookedly on their rusted hinges. Inside, it was a cathedral of shadows and the smell of old hay. Light streamed through gaps in the roof, illuminating swirling dust motes. And there, against the far wall, was his workbench. It was just as he'd left it. Tools hung in neat outlines on a pegboard, saws, hammers, wrenches, and, lying on the bench itself, a heavy-duty crowbar and a sledgehammer. They were right there, as if waiting for us. I grabbed the crowbar, its cold iron weight feeling both strange and familiar in my hands. Mia picked up a large flashlight from the bench, flicking it on. A powerful beam cut through the gloom. "You're really going to do this?" she asked, but there was no protest in her voice now. There was only a nervous energy, a kind of shared, fearful excitement. Back in the cellar, the single bare bulb seemed to cast more shadows than light. The air was frigid. I handed Mia the flashlight. "Shine it right there," I said, pointing to a seam in the new mortar. I wedged the tip of the crowbar into the crack and leaned on it with all my weight. Nothing happened. The mortar was solid, unyielding. "It's no use," I grunted, sweat already beading on my forehead despite the cold. "It's like solid rock." "Use the hammer," Mia suggested, her voice tight. "Hit the crowbar, like a chisel." It was a good idea. I positioned the crowbar again, and she was right. I didn't have a chisel, but this would work. I gripped the sledgehammer. It was heavy, unwieldy. I took a deep breath, swung, and brought it down on the end of the crowbar. The clang of metal on metal was deafening in the small space. It echoed off the stone walls, a sharp, violent sound. A tiny puff of dust and a few chips of mortar flew out. It was a start. I did it again, and again. The rhythm was punishing. Swing, clang, chip. Swing, clang, chip. My arms started to ache, my shoulders burning. Mia stood beside me, holding the flashlight beam steady, her face pale and set. She didn't say a word, just watched, her knuckles white where she gripped the light. After what felt like an hour, a deep crack appeared. A fissure ran from the point of the crowbar up through one of the stones. "It's working," I panted, dropping the sledgehammer for a moment to wipe my arm across my face. I picked up the crowbar again and jammed it deep into the new crack. I put my whole body into it, gritting my teeth. There was a low groan, a grinding sound of stone against stone, and then a chunk of the wall gave way, falling inward into darkness. A puff of stale, dead air washed over us. It was the air of a tomb. We both flinched back. Mia coughed, waving a hand in front of her face. I peered into the hole. The flashlight beam cut into a black, empty space. It was a cavity. The wall wasn't just a repair. It was a seal. "There's something in there," I whispered. Getting the rest of the stones out was easier now that we had a starting point. We worked together, prying them loose one by one and letting them fall into the void. Soon, the opening was big enough to see clearly. Inside the cavity, sitting on the dirt floor, was a large, black metal box. It looked like a military footlocker. It was sealed shut with 2 heavy latches. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might break. This was it. This was the secret. "Help me get it out," I said to Mia. The box was incredibly heavy. It took both of us, grunting and straining, to drag it out of the hole and into the center of the cellar. It sat there on the packed earth, solid and menacing under the single bare bulb. It had no lock, just the heavy-duty latches. I knelt down, my fingers trembling as I fumbled with the first one. It was stiff, but I managed to pry it open with a loud snap. Then the second. I looked at Mia. Her eyes were huge in the dim light. I took a deep breath, planted my hands on either side of the lid, and lifted. The hinges creaked in protest. The first thing I saw was money. Stacks and stacks of it, bundled in paper bands. $100 bills. It was an impossible amount of cash, more than I had ever seen in my life. It had to be tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. Mia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Leo!" But as stunning as the money was, it wasn't what held my attention. Sitting on top of the stacks of cash was a thick, sealed envelope made of heavy, cream-colored paper. On the front, in my uncle's familiar, neat, architectural script, were our names. Leo and Mia. My hand shook as I reached in and lifted it out. It was heavy, filled with many pages. I broke the wax seal, which was stamped with the image of an oak tree, and unfolded the letter. The date at the top was from 7 years ago, just a few days after he had disappeared. "Read it," Mia whispered, her voice hoarse. "Read it out loud." I cleared my throat and began. "My dearest Leo and Mia," the letter started. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and enough time has passed for you to come home. I hope you've come home. I am so sorry. I know those words are not enough. I know that for the past 7 years you have lived with a story about me. You've been told I abandoned you. You've probably come to hate me for it. I don't blame you. But I need you to know it isn't the true story. The truth is, I never left you. Everything I did to save you." I had to stop, my vision blurring. I swiped at my eyes angrily and continued reading. "I was not always a farmer, Leo. Before your mother died, before I came here, I had another life in the city. I worked as a structural engineer for a very large, very powerful construction firm. It took me too long to realize that the company was a front. It was a money laundering operation for a dangerous criminal syndicate. When I found out, I went to my boss. That was my mistake. He was part of it. They made it very clear that I had two choices: become part of their world or be silenced. I was a coward. I ran. I changed my name, bought this farm with the last of my clean money, and tried to disappear. My mind was reeling. Our quiet, simple uncle. An engineer? A criminal syndicate? It sounded like something from a movie. For years it worked. I was just Silas Blackwood, the quiet farmer. I was safe. Then your parents died, and I became your guardian. And you two, you were the best thing that ever happened to me. You filled this empty house with life. You gave me a reason. I stopped running. I started living. But they found me. A few months ago, one of them showed up at the farm. They hadn't forgotten me. They wanted to use the farm, its remote location, its big outbuildings, for their business. A place to store things they didn't want found. I told them no. I told them to leave me and my family alone. A week later, they sent me a picture. It was of you, Leo, getting off the school bus. The message was clear. I could no longer protect you by myself. If I stayed, I would be putting you in constant danger. If I went to the police, they would hurt you before I could even finish my statement. I could feel Mia trembling beside me, even though we weren't touching. This wasn't a story of abandonment. This was a nightmare. So I made a plan, the letter went on. A terrible plan, but the only one I had. I knew if I simply vanished, the state would have to step in. The foster care system is a broken, ugly thing, I know that. I knew it would be hard for you. But I also knew it was anonymous. It was a place where you would be hidden, where they wouldn't think to look for you. Safer with strangers than you ever could be with me. I staged my disappearance. I made it look like I just ran away. I sold off my truck and some equipment for cash, quietly. This money, he wrote, and I glanced down at the impossible stacks in the box, is for you. It's everything I could scrape together. It's your fresh start, your college fund, your freedom. Take it. Disappear yourselves. Build a new life, a good life. That is all I have ever wanted for you. I had to pause again, my throat thick with emotion. The story we had been told, the story that had defined us, was a lie. He hadn't left us. He had hidden us. There is one more thing, the letter concluded. Underneath the money, you will find another package. It contains all the evidence I collected against these people back when I first discovered what they were. Ledgers, account numbers, names. It's enough to bring them down. It's enough to clear my name. But using it will be dangerous. It will mean stepping out of the shadows. It will mean a fight. I do not ask this of you. The choice is yours, and yours alone. You can take the money and the life it can buy you, and no one would blame you. Or you can take this evidence and fight for the truth. I trust your judgment. Whatever you decide, know this. Leaving you was the hardest thing I have ever done. Every single day for these last 7 years, wherever I am, I have been thinking of you. You were never abandoned. You were, and are, deeply and completely loved. Your uncle, Silas. When I finished reading, the silence in the cellar was absolute. It was a heavy, ringing silence, filled with the weight of 7 years of misplaced anger and grief. I looked at Mia. Tears were streaming down her face, silent and unstoppable. She wasn't making a sound, just letting them fall. The anger she had carried for so long, her primary defense against the world, had shattered. And all that was left was a deep, profound sorrow. The man she'd spent half her life hating had, in fact, been her fiercest protector. I felt hollowed out, scoured clean. The guilt I'd secretly carried, the childish belief that we had been too much trouble, that we had driven him away, was gone. In its place was a vast, aching love for this man I had barely understood. He hadn't been a coward. He'd been the bravest person I had ever known. We sat there on the cold dirt floor of the cellar, the air thick with dust and the smell of damp earth, the open box between us like a wound. The stacks of cash seemed obscene now, almost an insult. They represented a life of quiet escape, a life bought with our uncle's sacrifice. But the letter offered another path, a harder path, a path of confrontation and risk. I reached into the box, my hand pushing past the bundles of money. Underneath them, just as the letter said, was a large, oilskin-wrapped package, tied securely with twine. I lifted it out. It was heavy with paper. The evidence. The truth. "We can't just take the money," Mia said, her voice thick and broken. It was the first thing either of us had said. Her words surprised me. Mia had always been the practical one, the one who dreamed of escape, of a normal life. The money was her dream, made real. "We can't let them get away with it," she repeated, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. Her grief was already hardening into something else. Resolve. A cold, clear anger, but this time it was aimed at the right people. Not after what they did, what they made him do. She was right. I knew she was right. But I was terrified. All my life, from the moment we entered the system, the primary lesson had been to survive. And survival meant staying quiet. Don't make trouble. Don't draw attention. Be invisible. The group home was a masterclass in this. You learned which kids to avoid, which staff members to placate. You learned to swallow your anger, to hide your fear, to make yourself small. It was a lesson I had learned too well. The evidence in that package was the opposite of small. It was a bomb. Using it would make us the center of a very dangerous kind of attention. I looked at the cash. $20,000, Ms. Albright had said the farm was worth. This box held at least 10 times that. It was enough to vanish. We could go anywhere, get a nice apartment, new clothes. I could go to community college, get a trade. Mia could go to a good high school, a private one even. We could have the life that was stolen from us, a normal, quiet, safe life. All we had to do was take the money, walk away, and leave the ghosts of Blackwood Farm behind. All we had to do was let our uncle's sacrifice be a secret forever. Have you ever been faced with a choice like that? A choice where the easy path felt like a form of betrayal, where the right thing to do was also the scariest thing you could possibly imagine. If you have, maybe you can understand the paralysis I felt in that moment. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff with a soft, easy path leading away from the edge, and a single frayed rope leading down into a storm. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to make a choice like that, because sitting there in that cold, dark house, I felt completely and utterly alone, caught between the life I wanted and the man I now knew I had to be. My uncle's letter had rewritten my entire life. It had taken the story of a boy who was left behind and replaced it with the story of a boy who was protected. It was a gift, a terrible, beautiful gift, and it came with a responsibility. I looked at Mia. Her face was tear-streaked and pale in the gloom, but her eyes were burning with a fire I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was conviction. She had already made her choice. She was just waiting for me. I thought about the way Mrs. Gable at the group home had looked through me, the way the system had turned us into case numbers and statistics. We had spent 8 years being powerless, being victims of a story we had no control over. This was the first time in our lives we had been given real power. The power to choose, the power to fight back, the power to finish our uncle's story. Selling the farm and taking the cash from the developer, Pioneer Valley Estates, now felt disgusting. The letter had mentioned a powerful construction firm. The name of the developer clicked into place with a sickening lurch. It was probably them. They weren't just buying land, they were trying to bury a secret. They wanted to bulldoze the last piece of Silas Blackwood's life, to erase him completely. Slowly, I reached out and closed the lid of the metal box. The click of the latches echoed in the silence. It was a sound of finality. "Okay," I said, my voice hoarse but steady. "We do it his way." A wave of relief washed over Mia's face, so profound it was like watching a mask dissolve. She nodded, a single sharp movement. We were in this together. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was no longer in charge. For the first time since I was 10 years old, I knew exactly what I had to do. We were no longer just surviving. We were fighting. My first act as a man with a purpose was to find my phone. The battery was at 15%. I found the letter from the law firm and dialed the number for Ms. Evelyn Albright. My hand was shaking, but my voice, when I spoke, was surprisingly firm. "Ms. Albright, please, this is Leo Blackwood." There was a pause on the other end. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "I was expecting your call. Have you and your sister had a chance to consider the offer from Pioneer Valley Estates? The deadline is approaching." "Yes," I said, taking a deep breath. "We've considered it. We're not selling." Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear her calculating, recalibrating. "I see," she said carefully. "May I ask why? Given the tax situation, it's by far the most financially prudent option." "We're at the farm now, Ms. Albright," I said, my voice dropping lower. "And we found something. Something our uncle left for us." I could hear the change in the air over the phone line. Her professional detachment was cracking. "Something he left for you?" "We need to meet," I said, "as soon as possible. We have something you need to see. It's about our uncle. It's about why he really disappeared." There was a long silence on the line. I imagined her in a sleek, modern office, surrounded by law books and leather, trying to make sense of this call from a teenage boy in a dusty, derelict farmhouse. When she finally spoke, her tone had changed completely. The cool professionalism was gone, replaced by a cautious, focused intensity. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "don't touch anything else. Don't talk to anyone. I'll be there in 3 hours." The line went dead. I looked at Mia. "She's coming," I said. The weight of what we had just done settled over us. We had just declared war. We took the metal box, the oilskin package, and the letter upstairs. We couldn't leave them in the cellar. We hid the box in the back of the deep closet in our uncle's bedroom, behind his old shirts. It felt safer there. Then we waited. The 3 hours stretched into an eternity. We didn't talk much. We sat in the dusty living room, the white-sheeted furniture our silent companions, and listened to the house groan and settle around us. Every gust of wind, every skittering sound from the walls, made me jump. I kept expecting a car to pull up the driveway, but not Ms. Albright's. Men in dark suits, like in the movies. It was a childish fear, but it felt intensely real. Finally, We heard the crunch of tires on the dirt lane. A sensible, dark blue sedan, the kind of car a lawyer would drive, pulled to a stop where the taxi had been. A woman got out. She was tall, in her late 50s, with sharp gray hair cut in a severe bob. She wore a tailored pantsuit that looked completely out of place against the backdrop of the decaying farm. This was Evelyn Albright. She walked up to the porch with a brisk, no-nonsense stride, her expression unreadable. I opened the door before she could knock. "Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, her eyes sharp and intelligent. They took in my worn jacket, my nervous posture, and Mia standing behind me. "I'm Leo. This is my sister, Mia." "Ms. Albright," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, her skin cool. "You said you found something." We led her inside. She took in the sheet-covered room with a single, sweeping glance, her face betraying no emotion. "Show me." I led her upstairs to the bedroom and retrieved the envelope. I handed it to her. She took it, her eyes scanning the names on the front, her brow furrowing slightly. She pulled out the pages and began to read. We stood there in silence as she read the entire letter, her expression growing more and more grim with each page. She was a fast reader, her eyes flying across the lines of my uncle's script. When she finished the last page, she stood perfectly still for a long moment, the papers held loosely in her hand. The professional mask was gone. In its place was a look of profound shock, mixed with something else, a kind of weary anger. "I knew it," she whispered, more to herself than to us. "I knew Silas wasn't the type to run." She looked up at us, and for the first time, I saw the sympathetic woman behind the formidable lawyer. I was his lawyer for a few years before he left. He came to me when he first bought this place. He was a good man, a private man. This story never sat right with me. She looked from me to Mia, her gaze softening. "You two have been through an ordeal I can't even imagine." Then the lawyer returned. Her back straightened, her focus sharpened. "The package," she said. "The evidence he mentioned." I retrieved the oilskin-wrapped bundle and handed it to her. She placed it on the dresser and began to untie the twine with quick, deft fingers. She unrolled the covering. Inside were several ledgers, their columns filled with my uncle's neat handwriting. There were also photocopies of bank statements, transaction records, and a list of names and corporate entities. At the top of the list was a familiar name: Pioneer Valley Estates. Ms. Albright let out a sharp, quiet breath. "They're not just trying to buy the land," she said, her voice cold as ice. "They're trying to bury the evidence. This farm is the last loose end." The consequences of our choice were no longer abstract. They were sitting on the dresser, written in black and white. Ms. Albright spent the next hour on her phone, pacing back and forth in the dusty bedroom. Her voice was low and urgent, filled with legal jargon and names I didn't recognize. She was arranging things, pulling strings, calling in favors. The world she operated in was a world of power and influence, a world completely alien to us. When she was finally done, she turned to us. "All right," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Here's what's going to happen. You two are not staying here. It's not safe. I have a friend, a retired judge, who has a guest house about an hour from here. You will stay there. No one will know where you are. I am taking this evidence directly to a contact I have in the State Attorney General's office, someone I trust implicitly. We are going to bypass the local authorities. We can't take any chances." The next few weeks were a blur of sterile, unfamiliar rooms. We were moved from the judge's quiet guest house to a secure, state-provided apartment. There were interviews with serious-faced investigators who treated us with a strange mixture of pity and respect. They asked the same questions over and over, and I repeated the story of the cellar, the box, and the letter until the words lost all meaning. The world of our uncle, the world of the syndicate, began to take shape through newspaper articles and snippets of news reports. Pioneer Valley Estates was publicly named in a massive fraud and racketeering investigation. Arrests were made. High-profile businessmen, city officials. The empire my uncle had stumbled into was beginning to crumble. Through it all, Ms. Albright was our rock. She handled the press, the police, the lawyers. She shielded us from the worst of it, updating us in calm, measured tones. The tax lien on the farm was frozen, pending the investigation. The assets seized from the syndicate were vast, and she assured us that the pittance of back taxes on a rural farm would be easily cleared. We were witnesses, but we were also orphans who had just uncovered their family's secret history. The investigators were gentle with us. They brought us food, made sure Mia was enrolled in online classes to keep up with her schooling. They treated us like people, not just evidence. One evening, a senior investigator, a woman named Detective Ortiz, sat down with us. "You know," she said, "your uncle's name came up in an old cold case file. A John Doe. Body found in a burned-out car in a quarry about 100 miles from here, about a week after he went missing. It was ruled an accident at the time. We're reopening the case. We think we'll be able to give him his name back now." He hadn't just disappeared. They had killed him. The news was a final, brutal confirmation of what we already suspected. He hadn't run and hidden. He had run and been caught. His plan had saved us, but it had cost him his life. I didn't cry. I just felt a profound, cold clarity. We had made the right choice. This was justice. This was for him. Months passed. The world moved on. The investigation culminated in a series of high-profile trials. The name Silas Blackwood was mentioned in the press, no longer as a footnote in a local disappearance, but as the man whose meticulous records brought down a criminal empire. He wasn't a coward who ran. He was a hero. Finally, one crisp spring day, Ms. Albright called. "It's over," she said. "The farm is yours. The title is clear. The case is closed." It was spring when we finally went back. The drive up the lane was different this time. The overgrown branches had been trimmed back by a county crew. The sun was out, and the fields on either side of the road were turning a vibrant, hopeful green. The house still looked sad, but it no longer looked like a shipwreck. The sagging porch had been temporarily shored up with new lumber, a favor from one of the investigators. The boarded-up window had been replaced. It looked less like a ruin and more like a place that was waiting for its life to start again. We spent the first week just cleaning. We threw open all the windows, letting the fresh, clean air chase out the ghosts of dust and decay. We took down the sheets, washed them, and folded them away. We scrubbed floors, polished wood, and washed every single dish and cup. Mia, who had dreaded this place, worked with a quiet, focused energy. She was reclaiming it. I found my purpose in the barn. I cleaned and organized my uncle's tools, hanging them back on their pegboard outlines. I ran my hand over the smooth, worn handle of a hammer and felt a connection to him that was more real than any memory. This was his legacy. Not the money, not the land, but the work, the act of building and fixing. One afternoon, I went down into the cellar. The hole in the wall was still there, a dark, gaping wound. I had found bags of cement mix in the barn. I spent the rest of the day carefully, methodically, rebuilding the wall. I wasn't a stonemason like my uncle, and my work was rougher, less perfect. But as I set the last stone in place, smoothing the mortar with my trowel, it felt right. The wall was no longer a place to hide a secret. It was a memorial. It was a testament to the man who built it to protect his family. Standing back, I looked at my clumsy, earnest work, and I understood. We inherit things from the people who came before us. Sometimes it's a house or money. Sometimes it's the color of our eyes or the shape of our smile. But sometimes the most important inheritance is a story. For 8 years, we had lived with the wrong one. A story of abandonment that made Mia angry and made me quiet. But our uncle had left us the true story, hidden behind a wall of stone. He'd left us the truth, and with it, a choice. A choice to be brave when it would have been easier to be scared. A choice to fight for what was right, instead of accepting what was easy. That was our real inheritance. It wasn't the farm or the money that was now sitting in a trust account managed by Ms. Albright. It was the chance to become people our uncle would have been proud of. I looked out the newly cleaned kitchen window at Mia, who was on her hands and knees in the dirt, pulling up weeds from a patch of earth that had once been a garden. She looked up and saw me watching, and for the first time in a long time, she gave me a real, genuine smile. Not her old, sharp, defensive smile, but a new one, a hopeful one. The house was still old. The farm was still a massive, overwhelming amount of work. Our lives were not magically fixed. The scars were still there. But for the first time, we had a foundation. We had a home. Not just a piece of property, but a place to stand, a place to grow. If you've ever had to rewrite the story you were handed, if you've ever had to fight to find the truth underneath the version of your life that everyone else accepted, I see you. If you've ever had to find your own definition of family or home, not from a place of comfort, but from a place of loss and struggle, then this community is for you. Thank you for listening to my story, to our story. It means more than you know. Please, subscribe if you haven't already, and if you feel comfortable, share a piece of your own story in the comments below. What did you inherit that wasn't about money? What truth did you have to uncover to find your way? I promise you, I read every single one. And I promise you this too, you're not alone in that fight.